All right, it's 3:02, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to the Roosevelt Institute Book Club. For those of you who are new to this, I am Hannah Gerch-Begley. I help direct the Roosevelt Institute's economic policy think tank, which essentially means I just get to work with a lot of really smart people, including our fellows. And we host these book talks roughly every other month to feature authors whose books offer new takes on topics that Roosevelt studies. The way we structure this is that we'll start by hearing from our feature author, who will set the stage for us and tell us about their book project. And then I'll have a few questions for her to dive deeper. And then we'll open things up for questions from the audience. So you can put questions in the chat at any time as they occur to you. And when we get to that Q&A portion, I'll moderate and I'll read those out. Or you can wait and then come off mute during the Q&A and ask your question directly. So today I am thrilled to welcome Lenore Palladino. Lenore is Associate Professor in the Department of Economics and the School of Public Policy at UMass Amherst, a Research Associate at the UMass Amherst Political Economy Research Institute, and most importantly, in my view, a Senior Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. And Lenore has been working in different capacities with the Roosevelt Institute for years and is just a key part of our community. And so I'm so happy that she's joining us today. Lenore holds a PhD from the New School University in economics and a JD from Fordham Law School. Lenore, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Um, so it's great to be here with Roosevelt. A lot of this book had its genesis in papers and conversations and work that I did at the Roosevelt Institute, first as a staff member and then as a fellow for many years. So I'm really excited to be here with this community. I want to thank Roosevelt. And I'm just going to show you the book. This is the book. Oops, the blur is making it funny. I'm going to show you the book. Yeah, thank you. Good Company. And I'm going to try to give just a brief overview at the beginning of the concepts in the book and the main arguments, and really hope to mostly engage in conversation. So, and I just also want to start out by stating the obvious. 2 days after the inauguration, it feels very difficult for me to focus on the kind of policymaking that would require deep structural reform, or in some ways to focus on issues of corporate governance at all, with deportations, pardons of the January 6th rioters, and so much more going on. It's a tough moment. And yet, I really think that corporate and elite power is what got us here, right? We may have a new class of corporate oligarchs in Elon Musk and his crew, but the underlying power of the economic elite and neoliberalism as our dominant economic ideology really is critical to understanding how we got here. And I believe it's built in part on an edifice of shareholder primacy, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So, the purpose of the book's title is Good Company: Economic Policy After Shareholder Primacy. The book's purpose is twofold. The first is to provide a framework for the political economy of corporations that addresses what they actually do, rather than a theory that is disconnected from reality. And then the second goal for the book is to put forward a set of policy reforms that would rewrite the rules, to use a phrase that originated with Roosevelt and Professor Stiglitz, who I see there, to rewrite the rules of how corporations operate and make decisions, to push more in the direction of innovation and productivity rather than extractive shareholder primacy. So I see the task of understanding the political economy of corporations and markets as requiring investigating not just one, but several questions about corporations. We need to start with asking, how do corporations produce and innovate? Then we need to ask, how does the allocation and distribution of profits work? That's where shareholder primacy starts. I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but it starts with that second question. We need to understand who is in charge of corporate decision making, and we need to understand what are the laws, regulations, and court cases that shape these choices. So, in the book, I first go through a theoretical overview of the mainstream neoliberal model of shareholder primacy and alternative ways of thinking about the political economy of corporations. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And building on the work of so many other economists and scholars and leading thinkers. And then I go through a set of policy interventions that I think are critical to actually shape our corporate decision making towards innovation and productivity. I want to be really clear that I don't see these policies as changing the economy on their own. We obviously need labor law reform. We need so many other areas of reform that brilliant people write about. So I'm focusing on this specific question of shareholder primacy, but it's necessary but not sufficient. Why I wrote this book is that as an organizer in unions and in communities for a long time, I saw how throughout so many different campaigns, whether we were fighting over working conditions and wages in the United States or around the globe, we saw that corporations had tremendous resources. We saw that the money was there. And the question was where was it going, right? This was really motivating for me back when I was a student organizer in the 1990s, participating in what we called then the anti-globalization movement, and really continued through my work with unions into the present day. And now, as an academic economist, I became really motivated to write this book and work on the political economy of corporations because the theory of the corporation used in mainstream graduate economics and in law schools is really empty of content in terms of how production and innovation happens, which means it's unrelated to how corporations actually work. And importantly, even in pluralist departments, where that theory may not be at the center, there still isn't enough attention to determining what a useful theory of corporations might be. So let me very briefly try to describe the theoretical part of the book, and then I'll talk about the policies, and then we can go back into all of it. It's hard to condense. Um, so I start out, as I said, with this political economy of corporations and markets framework that asks, how does innovation and production occur? Then asks, how do allocation and distribution processes work? Who's in charge and what are the rules? It's important to state at the outset that private corporations never stand outside of the public realm. Governments are always shaping markets. And indeed, what differentiates a corporation from other types of businesses is its stamp of approval from the government, right? Its permission to operate, to have limited liability and perpetual existence. A business can't operate as a corporation without public permission. This means we have as the public expectations that in exchange for this privilege to operate, the public has the right to set the rules of the social control of business, to use a phrase from an earlier time. In the US, today, state and federal law define the purpose of the corporation as distributing profits to shareholders. This is based on neoliberal economic and legal theory that claims that shareholders, those who buy corporate stock and either hold it or trade it, are the most critical stakeholders for corporations. The claim is that shareholders are the only group who should vote on the most important corporate decisions and for whose benefit corporate profits should be distributed. It's a theory of allocation, not innovation and production, which I think is very odd when you stop and think about it, right? It ignores the fact that corporate productivity improves and happens mainly from the contributions of the workforce, corporate leadership, and investments of the state. But it's persisted because we've been captured by this myth that shareholders are investors, or the idea that shareholding and investing are the same thing, which is really captured in the language that we use, right? We have this idea that buying shares means that corporations have more financial ability to engage in innovation and production, even though when we buy shares on the open, publicly traded stock markets and financial markets, we're buying it from another person uh, who bought it from someone else and giving funds to them. The funds don't go back to the corporation except in the original issuance of shares. And we can talk more about that if folks are interested. So when considering the necessity of innovation, there's actually a very rich history in economics that just isn't really taught or top of mind anymore about how innovative enterprises work. So economists like Edith Penrose, Bill Lazonick, other institutional economists have developed tremendous theories about how corporations are innovative based on their collective and cumulative learning that happens over time and because of the public and collective investments made in their capabilities. So we need corporate leaders and workers to be able to engage in this collective and cumulative learning. And in order to do so, we need social conditions that allow them to have strong organization, a clear sense of strategy, as well as the financial commitments that enable companies to take risks. So economic theories of innovation ground investment decision making not in comparisons of marginal prices and marginal revenue, but in the long-term goals that corporations have for the survival and dominance of their product markets. Shareholder primacy, in contrast, has really pushed against investment and innovation and focused on how profits should be allocated, right? Who gets the spoils of corporate productivity? Shareholders. Who makes decisions? Shareholders. I've written a lot and done work around stock buybacks, which are a particular aspect of shareholder primacy and shareholder payments that we can talk about more in the discussion. But there's been a tremendous explosion, and it keeps going up in shareholder payments being made by publicly traded companies, for which we can see really robust data. And there's also increasing shareholder payments happening in the private, quote unquote, private financial markets, where disclosure is not required in all kinds of practices with fancy names like dividend recapitalizations and leverage buyouts and everything. But as we're seeing the center of gravity in finance move toward the private financial markets, we also need to understand how shareholder primacy is working in those markets. So there's a lot more to say, obviously, about the theory, how the theory of shareholder primacy is constructed and what's really flawed about it. Um, the second half of the book focuses on policies that would actually shift us towards a more innovative economy and away from an extractive economy. And these policies are not, exhaustive. There's certainly so much more we need to do, but I'll just talk about a few of them that I tried to really spell out in the book. And again, a lot of these came out of Roosevelt working papers, conversations with leaders on the Hill, et cetera. So the necessary condition is that corporations, especially large corporations, should be chartered at the federal level, not the state level, right? We live in a global economy. Corporations chartered at the state level, they can choose what state they are chartered in. They can't do this with other branches of law. A company in California can't choose to not follow California, wage and hour law, for example, but they can choose to follow corporate governance law of the state of Delaware, for example. So we should have a federal charter for corporations. The second set of policies really concern financial extraction. So limits on stock buybacks, financial transaction taxes, other forms of policies that would actually constrain the ability of corporations to extract, for shareholders to extract from corporations. And I should say that, again, this is where the book's policy is mostly written focused on the publicly traded markets, but I'm right now really much more focused on what's happening and trying to understand what policies would work in the privately held corporations. The third set of policies are about the corporate board, right? The center of decision making. We need to actually change how we understand what their responsibilities are and who can serve on corporate boards. So the responsibility of the board right now runs solely to the shareholders, right? We can change that as part of remaking the rules that govern corporate behavior so that corporate boards are responsible to the corporate entity itself, to its success, right? To the stakeholders that make up the corporation, but to the innovative and productive capacity of the corporation itself. And we also could, like many other countries do, include the workforce as a representative voice on corporate boards. Workers know how the corporation is producing and innovating, or how they're not, and have a tremendous amount to offer. And then a final proposal that I wrote about is really transforming who shareholders are. Another way to deal with shareholder primacy is to change the aperture of who shareholders are. So let me just close by saying that, some of this framework and policies was seeing some momentum in the Biden administration, in the attention within the industrial policy discussions to, a commitment to produce and see companies, especially in clean energy and semiconductors and so many other fields, to see our productive capacity grow. And we saw, important steps towards limiting financial extraction, such as the ban on stock buybacks for companies that receive funding through the CHIPS Act. Now we're where we are, right? But I'll recall for us the word that I believe Rahm Emanuel coined in the Obama administration, which is the word crisis-tunity, right? And even though we have so much to do in the very short term to really hold on to our democratic nation, right? We also have to take advantage of this moment when the power of the corporate and financial elite is so, so, so clear, right? And say it doesn't have to be this way. We actually can change the way that our corporations operate so that we change the power that's held in the hands of a very few group of people. So with that, I'm really excited to have this conversation with everybody. So thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that very clear overview of the book and its goals. And I did want to just commend you. The book is remarkably slim, actually, which I think really does speak to the way in which you're able to present a lot of very complicated ideas very concisely in a way that I think is very accessible. So I did want to commend you for that. Um, so I want to
It
dive
helps to
into
have
a
a
bunch of
great editor. I'm going to shout out Chad Zimmerman. My editor is amazing.
we love editors. Everyone needs a good editor. So I want to dive into a lot of that, but I'm a historian, so I always like to start the conversation by thinking about how we got here. I really appreciate in the book you use throughout this case study of General Electric
Mhm.
as a way to sort of tell the story of how we got here. So could you walk us through that study and what it shows us?
Sure. And I wish I could actually go over to my wall and pull off the picture of my grandfather. So my grandfather was from an Italian immigrant working class family, served in World War II, and then worked in the GE plant in Lynn, Massachusetts for his entire career. Literally retired and got the watch, that you get as a shop floor worker in that era. And so that has shaped for me. GE was, we bought GE products in my family. It was an example of for a white male group of workers, a type of institution that really did provide a focus on innovation and production through including the workforce and supporting the workforce to be part of that collective and cumulative learning process. So GE is no more as it once was, right? There's some great books written about it that I cite in the book that start out with the history from Thomas Edison forward, but really show how it was an innovative enterprise for much of the 20th century, right? It was focused on producing more and more products that the American consumer desired and engaging in a lot of the large scale manufacturing that supported other corporations, right? It was very much an industrial producer as well. And then you have this emblematic figure of Jack Welch, who comes in the 80s, and you can pin on him in some ways the cultural transition towards shareholder primacy, where he said, lifetime loyalty, no more. Everything is about the share price. Everything at GE is pinned on making sure that GE's share price goes up and up and up no matter what. And that legacy was carried forward. Jeff Immelt and other executives who've taken over since then. And we could talk a lot about, some of the mistakes they made along the way, but the result is clear. GE ended up splitting up just 2 years ago or so, but it's really no longer in existence as a productive and innovative enterprise. It split up into different sectoral companies that took different pieces of it forward. And lots of people see that legacy of Jack Welch and that focus on shareholder price maximization as being the key to GE's downfall.
Absolutely. Thank you. And let's break down this shareholders as investors. This is core to the book is both sort of exposing this myth and then sort of breaking down and arguing that you think it should be innovation should be the goal instead. So for those who are not maybe as steeped in this world as you are, why is it that buying a stock in a company today is not the same as investing in that company? Like what has happened such that being a shareholder has really changed over that period? Thanks in part to Jack Welch.
Yeah. So for companies that issue their stock on the open or publicly traded stock markets, when they first issue their shares, and Bill Lazonick has a great example of Apple. When Apple first conducted its IPO, right, initial public offering, the people and institutions, mostly institutions, who buy that stock at the beginning do contribute financial resources directly to the corporation. But then that stock is traded on financial markets. And when it's traded among financial institutions, and in some cases, though less and less, among retail shareholders or retail shareholders. And so when I buy a stock from you, Hannah, on the open stock markets, you get the money. The money doesn't then go back to Apple, right? So it's a very simple concept that I think a lot of people actually miss. And the reason why we miss it, I think, in part, is our language, right? Well, there's two reasons. One is that we use the word investor, right? I try very hard to say shareholder, but I follow into it all the time. When we talk about investment, what we're referring to is people, households, and institutions uh, purchasing financial assets, right? Stocks, bonds, other forms of equity, to hold for asset appreciation purposes. We're not, in many cases, purchasing anything in which the seller of that asset then takes that fund and it goes back to the corporation for them to use. Um, I think it's also so dominant because we rely on financial asset appreciation for our retirement security, right? We have a system that we've built that in which Social Security does not give us a dignified retirement. And so, in order to retire, the workforce engages in this financial asset appreciation process. And in order to justify that in some ways, we have a cultural idea that we are the investors, right? That shareholders are the investors, that we are, necessary for the flourishing of the American economy. And while historically in the past, there's definitely important moments in time when purchasing shares actually contributed financial security to corporations in order for them to take risks, it's simply not how things work in the open markets today. And as I said before, in the private financial markets, by which I mean the part of the financial sector that does not have to disclose its activities. Private equity is what many people are familiar with, but also private credit funds, all kinds of other types of institutions. There as well, there are certainly important cases where venture capital, other entities are putting financing directly into companies. That is investment. In that case, shareholding is investment, which is why I try to say the myth that shareholders are always investors, not just the myth that shareholders are investors. Um, there are important moments when purchasing equity from a company enables that company then to take risks and thrive, especially on the private side of the financial markets. But on that side of the ledger, we don't know so much of what's happening because disclosure isn't required. So it's another example where there could be lots of extractive practices going on, and private equity, lots of people working on private equity have showed that that's true. And so I think we need more disclosure to know how shareholding and investing are playing out in the financial markets.
Absolutely. And given that reality, given that like for the vast majority of us, if I'm buying a stock, it's that money is not going to Apple, right? Like they're not benefiting directly from that exchange. Why then do the corporations put the shareholders first? And I think this is a really key part of the story that you're telling is like if they're not investing in innovation, why is it still so important to be like driving everything the corporation does towards giving those people money?
So there's a great question. There's several different answers, many different answers. One is the most basic. The leaders of corporations are themselves oftentimes receiving most of their pay, most of their remuneration through the appreciation, the rise in stock prices, right? Stock value. They construct all kinds of different mechanisms for doing so, but the basic fact is that they are able to make their own pay rise through seeing share prices rise, whether or not that's due to some fundamental improvement in the value of the company, which is what we're supposed to think that share prices represent, or whether it's through some type of manipulation or speculation, whether that be legal or maybe somewhere in the hazy middle, right? They're able to engage in plenty of this behavior. The Another reason is that it is the law, right? If you are a company that's chartered in the state of Delaware, which is where more than half of our Fortune 500 companies are chartered for some of the reasons I spoke about earlier, you are required to maximize shareholder value. That is what the um, fiduciary duty, the responsibilities of the corporate board says. And this is so important because what happens is that if a company's board is engaged in trying to engage in like a balancing act between let's invest in new products and services, let's invest in our workforce, and we will make shareholder payments at the same time, shareholder institutions can sue and win and say that the corporate board made an error, erred in making using the financial resources of the company to invest in the workforce. This has happened with American Airlines. It happened, there's lots of examples, but I think the fear of the power of what we call the activist investors, right? The dominant shareholder institutions in our society, that really shapes what corporate boards, how they think about their decision making. And then finally, and this is something that I'm also writing more about now, it's in the book, but I think it needs a lot more discussion, and other people have been thinking about this and writing about this as well. I again think this cultural myth that shareholders are investors. You see Larry Fink of BlackRock, one of the dominant asset managers, he always talks about how his funds are about the teachers and firefighters and about the retirement security of your middle class American households. And if we think that shareholder primacy is what enables us as everyday non-elite people to have retirement security, we're going to believe that that power, that focus on shareholder and financial asset appreciation, we're going to believe that it benefits us instead of thinking about, okay, if on uh, the majority of corporate equity is held at the very, very top, right? So the vast majority of the benefit is going to white, wealthy households at the very top of the income and wealth distribution. And we could get better economic security through, strong wages and working conditions, through a, other way of structuring our retirement security. We don't necessarily see these issues as tied together, but I think that myth and that framework really keeps them tied together in our society.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, a great moment for us to transition to talking about the solutions that you referenced at the top. And in the book, you use this phrase I love, radical pragmatism, to sort of think about how some of these ideas might seem very common sense, but are actually taken as quite radical or quite disruptive to the status quo. Um, so let's start, I guess, with this idea of charters, and maybe you
Mhm.
can sort of dig into a little bit more like how the current charter system works, and then you in the book argue very strongly that we should transition to a federal charter system. So talk us through a little bit about that, why you think that would help, and also why is that a radical idea? What stands in the way of that? uh,
Yeah, maybe that's the least radical idea in some ways. It's so just
yeah.
foundational. So, a corporate charter is essentially a legal permission to operate from a Secretary of State that turns a business that otherwise would be, closely tied to an individual or set of individuals to its own entity. So, the whole point of a corporation is that if I am a shareholder of it or somehow affiliated with it, I don't bear responsibility for its debts. I can lose the value of the shares that I've purchased. But if the company, goes belly up and has, tremendous amounts of liability to many, many creditors, for example, I won't be responsible. That's different than a partnership or small businesses, that people own that they are themselves personally tied to. So corporations have this requirement that they have what's called a charter that comes from the Secretary of State. And for all kinds of historical reasons, those charters were, allowed, companies were allowed to apply for and get charters from states that they weren't operating in, right? From states where they didn't have employees. Maybe today they sell products there because they sell products everywhere, but in the past they weren't selling products there, and where they don't have any physical location. So Delaware, for historical reasons, became in the 20th century the state in the United States where many, many companies chose to get chartered. In the more recent times, we've seen many companies move offshores out of the United States entirely to be chartered in other jurisdictions. But in the United States, Delaware is really the dominant jurisdiction. What this means is that Delaware as a state relies heavily on the revenue from these corporate charter applications. If you're a corporation, you have to pay fees every once in a while to keep your charter alive. And the state relies on these charters and therefore keeps corporate governance rules very, very business friendly, right? It's very hard to see things changing drastically in terms of the proposals that I put forth in the state of Delaware. However, corporations are global. We no longer live in an economy where any large corporation operates solely in a single state. So I think rather than try to change rules such that if you are a California based company, you must be chartered in California, we should simply have a federal charter for large corporations. This was what Senator Elizabeth Warren proposed in the Accountable Capitalism Act that many of us at Roosevelt were excited about and worked on back in those days. And the idea was that companies over a certain threshold in terms of revenue would be required to get a federal charter to layer on top of their state charter. This is how it works in the banking sector. It should work this way in the non-financial sector as well. And I also think that from a more sort of intellectual or sort of theoretical perspective, these charters are so important because they are what tell us that we have the ability as the public to set the rules of corporate governance. Companies get these benefits of limited liability and perpetual existence. The people who've set up the companies and then charter them get protection for themselves that they will not be personally on the hook for the activities of the company. And in exchange for that permission to operate, we should require that these large corporations do not make things worse for the society that it is giving them permission to operate.
Yeah, it seems like so obvious as you said, and yet, so yeah, can you talk us through a little bit about that question of like what's standing in the way of that happening?
Well, Congress, I don't know
Or
if you've met Congress. This is where I think that it's impossible to talk about economics without talking about politics. It's impossible to talk about politics without talking about economics. There's, of course, now in this new week more than ever, but consistently, we've had economic elites really having the ability to set economic policy at the federal level, and so there's really no interest in having a federal charter. You saw, we can go back to when Senator Warren proposed that bill, all kinds of attacks, some based on, nonsense, some based on, well, we have all this case law built up in Delaware. If we shift away from it, what will happen? All kinds of different issues. But I never heard an argument that seemed to really limit us from moving forward on that path. It's just really political will.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a bunch of other solutions that you offer, and I want to make sure that we also have time for questions from the audience. So I think my last question is just going to be, given what's happened this week and given sort of the year to come, we know that the Trump tax cuts are going to be a very live issue this year. For those who are unfamiliar with this, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as it was described back during Trump 1, is sort of up for renewal this year. And it's going to be, I think, a major flashpoint for figuring out, do they simply renew it? Do they change it? That kind of thing. You write a little bit in the book about this and about what it did to corporate taxation. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and about how corporate taxation plays into this larger story that you're telling us.
Yeah, lots and lots of detail there. But I think, sort of top line, we can think about how do our taxation policies create incentives for corporations to invest and innovate versus creating incentives for them to take on, for example, more debt, or create incentives for corporate leaders, both in the publicly traded markets and companies that are privately held, to incentivize them to engage in ways that enrich themselves. So I'm thinking, not just the corporate tax issues, but the issues that happened during the IRA, where there was up to the very last minute taxation language in the IRA about carried interest, which is the way essentially that that financial leaders in the private financial markets are able to capture such incredibly large gains for themselves. And that got dropped at the last minute, right? Because Kristen Sinema said it should be dropped. And so we have all these different areas of policy, both corporate policies that address individuals, and then as well as financial transaction taxes, which I'm looking again at Professor Stiglitz's name in the on my screen here, and that's something that he's been writing about for a very long time. It's actually was the topic of my dissertation long time ago now as well. I think those types of taxes are also incredibly important in terms of structuring what happens in the financial sector itself, right? And it's funny sometimes when we're talking about corporate activity, we end up talking so much about what's happening in the world of finance, right? As opposed to talking about the activities of non-financial corporations. This is a book about goods and services producing corporations, but in today's world, we can't talk about their activities without talking about the pressures, the powers coming from financial institutions. And so I think we need to think of taxation ideally as a tool that can be used across a range of policy areas. And you're making me actually think of a paper I think I wrote for Roosevelt in 2017 that was about taxation policy and how it can be used to reshape corporations towards innovation and productivity. So it's a long road, but I think that we need to consider taxation as part of this set of solutions.
Absolutely. So at this time, I want to welcome the audience to ask some questions. Again, you can put questions in the chat and I'll read them out. You can put questions via the Q&A function, and I have a couple of questions that have already come in. And then also, if you're interested in asking your question directly, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you to come off mute and ask your question for Lenore. So just to kick us off, we have a question in the Q&A about stock buybacks, which is something that you talk about in the book. So maybe you can first, for people who don't really know what stock buybacks are, give us a brief outline of that. And then the question is, should they be outlawed?
So stock buybacks are the practice where companies that issue their stock on the open or publicly traded stock markets go to the open stock market and buy their stock back from somebody, an institution or an individual that holds it at that time. And that sounds sort of anodyne. It sounds like, okay, that's a corporation kind of playing with its balance sheet. But the purpose of these open mark share repurchases or stock buybacks is to increase the value of the company's share price because its overall market value is now distributed among fewer shares of stock, right? So we have like bigger pizza slices in the pie, right? When you have fewer of them. And that since that's its function, what that means is that it's funds that a company is using that, there's an opportunity cost where they're not using those funds to fairly pay their workforce, to invest in future productivity gains, et cetera. Um, and maybe they wouldn't be a problem if they were minimal, but they've grown to tremendous volume and they keep growing. So a lot of the reason for this is because we have a legal framework around them that essentially enables corporate leaders to personally benefit because they're able to use stock buybacks as a way to actually increase their own pay, and because we have um, a framework that I won't go into detail on it, but happy to with anyone who's interested later for many hours. We have a legal framework around stock buybacks that essentially lets companies engage in unlimited amounts of them. This is different than other advanced financial market countries, right? There's limits on stock buybacks in most other jurisdictions, which is why we don't see them exploding in the same way. So that's why they have a particular importance in the United States. Should they be outlawed? I mean, I have written a lot of comment letters and policy papers and done congressional testimony around this. I think that some bright line limits would be very, very clearly in the interest of shareholders themselves, who are not the most elite, concentrated shareholders of the majority of us who are shareholders. And I also think that they would make sure that companies are not engaging in market manipulation, manipulating the price of their own shares. And it's really interesting to understand that the legal idea of market manipulation is actually very complicated in the law. It's not simple to say when a company is manipulating the market price of their stock. So should they be outlawed altogether? Again, this is where I'm the radical pragmatist. There's a lot that I would totally change structurally. I think that it's very important at this point to keep focused also with specific discrete policies like putting bright lines on stock buybacks and really sort of walk and chew gum at the same time in terms of major structural reform and specific policy interventions.
Thank you. All right, so next up, I think we have Dale. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name.
Nope, you got it. You got it great. Thanks so much. And thanks so much, Lenore, for such a wonderful book and what a wonderful conversation. So I'm calling in from Delaware, which is the place that has changed my outlook on a lot of these issues. Unfortunately. And I've been struck here. So I have a question about jurisprudence and how you intend this book to land with lawyers and with judges, and what kind of interaction you've had. And in particular, I've been struck since living here. The degree to which that there's kind of a cult of legitimacy around the Court of Chancery and Delaware's laws that, as a non-lawyer, just a country historian, I was really surprised by. But also
Yeah.
that the way that it's kind of played out as a political crisis here in the last couple of years, where there's been some Chancery Court decisions that the defense bar has disagreed with, and now there's kind of a political debate happening here about whether or not the legislature should be allowed to publicly debate and examine the changes to the law that are usually passed through in secret. So I agree with you that Delaware is a problem in all kinds of ways. But I was wondering what your takeaway, given the kind of intellectual edifice that the Chancery Court has put together, that the corporate bar and the corporate law kind of broadly has put together. How do you see this work interacting with those folks who are and how has it what's the reception been insofar as you've got a long experience dealing with these ideas in different fora, so how has this worked through for you? I'd just like to
Yeah.
hear more about that.
Yeah, great point. And we can maybe connect after this to talk more in detail about. I've had a lot of interactions in Delaware. I think that this book is meant as it's an academic book. It's meant to really lay out a broader intellectual argument as well as a set of policies. So it's not engaging directly with what, the case law that's, the cases that are happening in Delaware right now, which people outside of Delaware may have heard of the ongoing fight over Elon Musk's pay package for Tesla, which is still happening through the Delaware courts, even though Tesla is now in Texas. It's a whole thing, right? So I'll just say as one example of where Delaware is so important, and also why I think these arguments are important for leaders in Delaware to think about, is former Chief Justice of the Court of Chancery, Leo Strine, has actually been a leading voice to rethink how these practices of shareholder primacy are hurting the economy. So if you look him up or Google him, he's written a whole series of articles that essentially say, yes, as a judge, he is required to follow the law, and the law in Delaware is to maximize shareholder value, and he did that faithfully. And in his life since retirement, he has written a tremendous amount about how problematic shareholder primacy is, how we need to look at stakeholder governance, and really think about, again, sort of where I started this conversation, the abilities of the workforce to really have a voice overall in corporations. So I think that there's a lot that leaders in Delaware are already engaged in. There's other folks coming out of the the corporate bar there who have been very engaged, for example, in the benefit corporation movement, creating a alternative framework for corporate charters where that set of responsibilities for corporate boards that I spoke about to stakeholders and to the corporation itself is in the charter of the corporation. That's really been developed by B-Lab, a wonderful nonprofit, and been supported by many leading legal practitioners in Delaware. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening there for sure.
Thank you. All right, next up is Sunny.
Hello. Thank you so much for taking my question and for the wonderful introduction. I was wondering, I had sort of two related questions. First was, did you have any, like, in your research, did you come across any examples of like international corporate charters that served as like an example, like beyond like co-determination and like that as like a, and second, did you find any link between state ownership and like how
Mm.
closely governments work with corporations and basically better, like more equitable outcomes?
So two great questions, and Sunny, you've been an incredible resource on many of these topics yourself. So, I'm not a comparative scholar, meaning I'm not someone who myself does research largely across different countries. Do what you know. I'm from the U.S. This is where I've focused in the belly of the beast. But there's been really important investigations of comparative corporate governance practices that have looked at, for example, Germany, Japan, other countries in the European Union. We have students here at UMass who are researching Indian corporate governance. I think there's a rich, body of literature on that topic, and the Anglo-American, the sort of US, UK model of shareholder primacy is not necessarily the norm around the world. Of course, many countries have different models that they follow, and some have more similar models, but a lot more guardrails around them. Some have entirely different models in terms of the way that business activity is structured. So it's sort of hard for me to give a concise answer, but I'll mention Steve Vogel and Gregory Jackson and so many other scholars who have done work on this. And then you mentioned, of course, public engagement with the private sector, which is something that I wrote a lot about with Roosevelt, both at the Gruen Institute, and thought a lot about over the last couple of years. Mariana Mazzucato has done, really path-breaking work on this topic. I think that, the public engagement with the private sector can be very productive and should have very clear corporate guardrails around it. So there's a Roosevelt paper by myself and Isabel Estevez that it's called The Need for Corporate Guardrails in Industrial Policy. And Sana, you worked on it as well. So the idea is really that as long as we have shareholder primacy, public investments are so important, as we saw in the IRA. But if we don't put very clear guardrails around them, we will see a lot of the gains from those investments be channeled towards the economic elite, who are the political elite, in the same way that shareholder primacy operates day to day. And I think it was really great that we saw at least green shoots, right? Some beginnings of guardrails be put in place. This is much more the norm in other countries that have public equity stakes. I went down a rabbit hole of the French agency, the French government shareholding agency, and all the rules and regulations that they have for their engagement with prominent French companies. There's a lot of other models that we can draw from, and I think it's going to be important to keep developing those in this bizarre time in which Trump proposes taking a public equity stake in TikTok. How do we think about these things in this new world? We're going to need to keep really having kind of vigorous debates about it.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Great. Next up, we have a question from Mike.
Hi, thanks so much. So my name is Mike. I actually work at B-Lab, so thanks for shouting us out. I have not read your book yet, very excited to. But my question is really around benefit corp legislation as an intervention in this sort of debate between shareholder primacy and stakeholder governance. I'm curious what you've seen in terms of how it's been effective and where it hasn't quite done what it intended to do, and where there needs to be further effort to sort of strengthen stakeholder governance legislation? And then ultimately, what are the limits of looking at governance as the sort of point of intervention versus ownership? And I'm thinking
Mhm.
about a variety of alternative ownership structures, employee ownership for sure, but also recent interest in perpetual purpose trusts, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is again a whole webinar in and of itself, and you and I should follow up offline. For folks who don't know, B Lab is a great nonprofit. I didn't know somebody was here, but I've been a big fan. Worked with the founders when it was getting started for a while. Um, and what they've created is a charter that says that the corporate board's fiduciary duty runs to all stakeholders. Now, this is an opt-in charter. So what that means is that business owners can choose to change their board responsibilities to run towards all stakeholders, but it's not a requirement, which is why we haven't seen a large-scale shift towards that type of the type of charter. I think it's been incredibly important in showing that businesses can survive and thrive with a stakeholder governance model. I think the evidence is on the ground, is very, very clear that it's been, some businesses thrive more than others and some fail, and that's capitalism. But I think it's been incredibly important to show proof of concept in many ways. I've lost track of how many states now have benefit corporation charters. At some point it was 34. It's probably more than that now. 40 states. That's great. So I think it's an incredibly important area to pursue. I think that I sort of deliberately in this broadest scope work don't talk about stakeholder governance because I think that we need to actually focus on the productive and innovative capacities of corporations, which requires far more than enabling various groups of stakeholders to engage. I think that especially for our very largest corporations, it requires these other structuring mechanisms. But I'm, again, Hannah pointed out radical pragmatism. I'm an organizer. I believe in making progress where we can. And I think the benefit corporation movement has been incredibly important. And I think there's been, a variety of different legislative forms that are interesting to compare and contrast. I don't know that I have any brilliant insights on which ones how I would do that at this moment. But I think if folks aren't familiar with B-Lab, you should definitely look them up.
Thank you. So we have another question in the Q&A, and this is about if you could speak more about worker participation on boards and who stakeholders are, which I think is something you referenced at the top of the call.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So over the last, I don't know, 10 years and then even more increasingly in the Biden administration, there was a lot of conversation about stakeholder governance, both in the benefit corporation context, but also in the context of industrial policy, right? If if the federal government is making a large grant to a battery company, to locate in a particular town, what is the engagement that, for example, the Loan Program Office former leader Jigar Shah had a whole podcast where he talked about the community engagement they would do. So we can think about the public and the community where physical production is happening as a stakeholder in this world of intangible production. All of us as platform participants, we can think about us as the product as stakeholders, also as consumers as stakeholders. But I think there's different kinds of groups of stakeholders, and some are closer than others to the center of corporate activity. And I really think the workforce is at the center there. So if folks aren't familiar in other countries, people talk a lot about Germany, but it's in other countries around the world, the workforce has representation on the corporate board the same way that shareholders do on large corporations. It's mandated by law. And what that enables, and this is a chapter in the book as well as some other articles, what it enables is essentially voice to bring a perspective on innovation and productivity that it can be lacking if you have only asset manager representatives who don't directly engage with the productive capacity of the board of the company at all. So in the chapter and in my writing, I really try to look at what would make worker participation on boards effective in the US context, where we have a very different overall economic context and certainly labor law context than European nations. And so I try to walk through what could actually make it effective here. But it's again one of those radical, pragmatic issues where it seems kind of obvious. Like you would want people who are engaged every day in producing a good or service to have a voice in the big decisions that are made by a company. Why not? What's the harm? This came up, I think, very clearly and poignantly during COVID, because it was the workers of some of our large, retail and food companies who were saying, "This is what we need to stay safe. This is what we need to make sure that the health and safety of the workforce and the customers is, as safe as possible." And there was nowhere for that voice to be heard where there wasn't union representation. And so I think that that kind of conversation happening between the workforce and other members of the corporate board could be incredibly beneficial if it's constructed in the right way in the context of US labor law.
Absolutely. And a good reminder, and your book sort of opens with this, but that like there's some base level labor law that needs to happen for all of this to really benefit us all. Well, we are almost at time, and so I'm going to wrap things up here. Lenore, this was such a lovely conversation. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your wisdom and your research. Good Company is on sale. We have a link in the chat if you are interested in purchasing your own copy. I highly recommend it. As I said, the Roosevelt Institute does these book talks roughly every other month. So we'll have another one in March. And please join us then. And join me in thanking Lenore for her time.
Thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate it. And everyone at Roosevelt is part of this project, so I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, we're so happy for you. Thank you so much again, and have a great rest of your Wednesday. Bye all.
Everyone.